On this worksheet tab, we're going to consider three alternative scenarios: a worst case, a most likely, and a best case. In each scenario, we will simultaneously change 4 of our input variables. To create a scenario, we go up to the Data tab, and then we select What If and our Scenario Manager. Currently, we don't have any scenarios defined, so let's go ahead and add a scenario. Our first scenario we're going to add is our worst case scenario. And the cells that we are going to change are going to be our bid price, which is cell B3, comma, our number of units, B4, comma, our sales growth, F7, comma, and our inflation rate, F8. And now we can go ahead and hit OK. Next pops up a box that's for our scenario values. In our worst case scenario value, our bid price will be $10. We will sell 100,000 units. We will have a negative 2% sales growth, and our inflation rate will be 5%. And let's go ahead and hit OK. Now we're going to add a second scenario, our most likely. So type in the name, most likely. Again, we're going to change cells B3, B4, F7, and F8. We could opt to change additional cells in this scenario or fewer cells, but in this case we're going to change the same 4 input cells. We'll hit OK. The values that are currently in our pro forma, the 13, 150, 5%, and 3%, those are what we consider our most likely, so we can just hit OK. We're going to add one more, which is going to be our best case scenario. And in our best case scenario, again, we're going to change the same cells, B3, 4, F7, and F8. Hit OK. But our values now will be a selling price of $15 a unit, 170,000 units, sales growth of 10%, and a 0% inflation rate. We'll hit OK. After we've defined our scenarios, we're going to want to indicate what summary variables we're interested, or what summary output fields we are interested in. We are interested, let's assume, we could pick anything, but let's say that we're interested in knowing what the operating cash flow will be in the first year, comma, our break-even net present value, comma, and our internal rate of return. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK, and first we're going to select a scenario summary. We would like our summary to show up on an additional or new worksheet tab. So hit OK, and here is our scenario summary. A couple things we notice first. One, the cell references B3, 4, 7, and 8, C26, 36, and 38, they aren't particularly useful. We need to remember what these cells were. Let's go ahead and name some cells on our worksheet before running our scenario manager. So let's go back to our scenario manager tab, and this time we're going to name some cells. Let's go to the bid price cell. We can click on cell B3, then we can come up to the name box right here, and we're going to type in bid underscore price. We can't have any spaces in our names for our ranges, and hit enter. Units. We're going to name this a slightly different way. If we come to the Formula tab and we go up to Define Name, click on Define Name, and a name pops up for this particular cell. The default will be the name to the cell in the immediate left, so we can hit OK. And now cell B4 is named Units. If I want to pick that cell up, I can just type in equals units, and there's my 150,000 units. Let's go ahead and undo that. The other cells I wanted to name were sales growth and inflation rate. In this case, again, I can either go to the name box and type in sales underscore growth and hit enter, or I can come down to the cell itself, select the Formula tab, define name. Now notice in this case when I click on the define name, nothing comes up as a default, and that's because the cell immediately to the left of cell F8 is blank. So I'm going to have to type in inflation underscore rate, and I'm going to hit OK. Now, my year one operating cash flow. I'm going to go ahead and define the name, the cell name. This time I'm going to use the name box. I'm just going to type in year one underscore OCF, and I'm going to hit enter. For my break-even net present value, I can make use of Excel's naming function, define name, and again, since there's something immediate to the left of that cell, it will by default pick up that name. I'm just going to change it to net present value because it's not necessarily the break-even net present value unless the net present value is 0. I'm going to hit OK. IRR, again, Formula tab, define name. It's picking up what's to the left. I'm happy with IRR, so I'll hit OK. Now, let's go ahead and go back and run our scenario manager. Data, what if, scenario manager, and I want to go ahead with the summary. I'm happy with those summary cells. I'm going to hit OK. Now notice I've got names all the way for each of my changing cells and my output cells, a much more useful worksheet. The one thing I still have is this dollar or this number sign or incapable to calculate in my worst case IRR. Let's go back to our Scenario Manager tab. Recall we said if we looked at the function wizard, we have the opportunity to select a guess. I'm assuming that because in this worst case scenario our IRR is negative, it's outside of the iterative guesses that Excel runs through in calculating the IRR. So let's seed it with a starting point of, let's say, negative 20% will be our guess, and we'll hit OK. Now let's try running our scenario manager one more time. Data, scenario manager, summary, OK. And sure enough, by specifying a beginning guess of negative 20%, Excel was able to go through its iterations and zero in on a final internal rate of return. So with our scenario manager now, we can compare our best case scenario with our most likely and also our worst case scenario. One other thing we can make use of in our scenario manager is if we go up to what if, scenario manager, we can have it show the best case results. So on best case, show. Now it's gone ahead and put all of our best case inputs into our pro forma and shown us the best case results. We could have shown the worst case. We could also show the most likely. So that's our scenario manager. It allows us to change more than one value or input variable at a time. Our data tables allow us to only change one variable and see how net present value, IRR, or a particular output of interest changes with respect to the change in one input, while our scenario manager allows us to vary a collection of inputs.